So, Furina's Rerun has been here for about a week now, and most of you probably already have her by now. But some of you may be wondering if it's worth it for you to pull her constellations. So in today's video, I'll evaluate which teams and DPS units that Furina's constellations should be an investment priority, or if you should prioritize investment elsewhere. Now do keep in mind this won't be a Furina guide video, but if you are looking for a good Furina guide, my written guide on Genshin mains is now updated for the current patch. Link will be in the pinned comment. Alright, so to make this easier to visualize, I'll be placing characters into 5 tiers. The first tier is characters where it's recommended to prioritize Furina's constellations for the team's vertical investment, so this will mainly be DPS characters that don't have very powerful early constellations of their own. The next tier will be characters that, for their team, it's more advisable to prioritize investment into either their own constellations or another support on their team that isn't Furina. The third tier is characters where it can go either way. You can prioritize investment into Furina or someone else on the team, and it won't be too much difference, you'll get great results either way. The fourth tier is for characters that ideally you wouldn't be using Furina to begin with, but if you are using her with them, then you should prioritize Furina's constellations for the vertical investment. The last tier is for characters that you really shouldn't be using Furina with at all to begin with. With that explained, let's get started with the characters that you should prioritize Furina constellations for. In this tier, I have Zhao, Lenny, Klee, Pyro Traveler, Ayato, Kokomi, Alhaitham, and Sino. With Zhao, his constellation 1 is pretty good, but Furina's constellations are just better. You can alternatively prioritize getting Zhang Yun to C2 instead of Furina, but I would recommend Furina's constellations before that, because Zhang Yun's buffing only applies to one target, while Furina's applies to everything. So she's improving your AoE damage, and Xianyun is not. The one caveat to this is that it seems Hoyo plans to have Farazan on Xianyun's banners, so if you don't have a C6 Farazan yet, then Xianyun should take priority, since you could possibly get her to C2 while going for the C6 Farazan that you needed anyway. Now, Linny has a pretty strong C1 and C2, but for his vaporized teams, Furina's constellations make a bigger impact, so I'd recommend getting Furina to C2 before moving on to Linny constellations. Klee has a good C2 with 23% defense shred, providing a nice buff to the team, but her C1 is not that great, so the overall increase from C0 to C2 on her isn't that good, so Furina's constellations are way better. And Furina does so much for Klee, giving her access to better 5-star weapons and a good artifact set, while forward vaporizing off of Klee's super fast pyro application, so I don't think Furina is ever being replaced on Klee's team, so it's worth going all in on Furina here. Pyro Traveler is here because they apply too much pyro for melt, so use them with Furina and not Seat Lali, so Furina's constellations are the way to go. Ayato and Kokomi's constellations are underwhelming while only increasing their own damage, but a lot of the damage on their teams come from sub DPS, so Furina's constellations are better. Alhaitham's constellations are also pretty underwhelming. His C2 is good, but it's nothing too special, so Furina's will always be better. You could go for Nahida C2 instead, but I wouldn't recommend that because Furina C2 is a bigger increase while having way better carryover to other teams than Nahida. Then it's pretty much the same story with Sino. His C1 is very underwhelming, and his C2 is good, but because the C1 before it isn't, the total increase from C0 to C2 isn't that much, so Furina's constellations are better. The only thing with this is, some Sino players prefer Overload over Quick Bloom, so if that's you, obviously don't pull Furina constellations if you aren't going to be using her anyway, but if you are playing Quick Bloom, definitely prioritize Furina's constellations. Now moving on to the next tier, the characters that you should prioritize their own constellations or someone else's before Furina's. For this, I have Neuvillette, Wanderer, Chaska, Hutao, Raiden, Clarend, Ito, Ayaka, Risley, and Kinich. For Neuvillette, his C1 is a bigger increase than Furina's while also giving him huge quality of life, and his weapon is also a massive increase, so I'd highly recommend getting him to C1 R1 first. Once you have that, then Furina's constellations are good to prioritize. Wanderer, getting him to C2 is a bigger increase than getting Furina's constellations. Additionally, Furina isn't always the best 4th slot on his team. You kinda treat the 4th slot of his team like a toolbox, varying between different units depending on the specific content you are facing. Furina is the general best go-to option, but I don't believe she always will be. I do believe she's going to be replaced there in the near future. So I'd recommend getting Wanderer to C2 R1 first, then you can go for Furina Constellations if you want to invest further and don't care to go all the way to C6 on Wanderer. With Chaska, the release of Mavrika and Lali kicked Furina out of Chaska's strongest team, as the front-loading AoE of Mavrika's Melted Burst helps Chaska's weaknesses out a ton. But if you are still playing Overvape Chaska and don't plan to switch her over to Melt, Chaska has very strong constellations of her own, so I'd advise getting her to C2 R1 before considering Furina constellations. Hu Tao, she gets about a 24% damage increase from C0 to C1, while also becoming much more forgiving to play, so her C1 should always be the number one priority. But once you have that, Furina's constellations should be the next priority. Raiden and Clorand, their strongest teams are Overload, so chances are you aren't using Furina with them to begin with. But even if you are, they both have very strong early constellations that you should be prioritizing instead. Now with Ito, if you are using him with Furina, you are probably playing double Geo with Shilonin. This might be a bit of a surprise, but I'd actually prioritize getting Ito to C2 over Furina's constellations in this team. The reason for that is, double Geo Ito is kind of a fraudulent team before C2. Shilonin is incapable of funneling particles to Ito, so he will very often end up in awkward situations where his burst isn't actually up yet by the time you swap to him, thus forcing you to cast Ushi before his burst for particles, wasting a lot of time and buff up time. This is very, very bad anytime it happens, but if you have Ito C2, he'll instantly refund 12 energy to himself each time he casts his burst, so you'll be far less likely to encounter the energy issues here. Ito C1 is also a lot better than you might think. On paper, over a full rotation, it's only about a 5% damage increase, but the way this constellation works is, it's increasing the damage you do in the first half of Ito's fill time by around 20%. So in practice, it's actually a very good increase, and its value will shine more and more as you get more investment into things such as Furina and Shilonin's constellations. So I would advise getting Ito to C2, then Furina's constellations, then Shilonin's. Next, Furina's constellations are great for Ayaka, but getting Shenna to C1 is a bigger priority, as Ayaka's ability to freely swap to Shenna whenever she wants makes that C1 a very big increase with her. Once you have Shenna C1, Furina's constellations are good to prioritize. Risley, his melt team with Furina is strong for him, but it has really annoying energy issues, so you'll likely do better using one of his new melt teams with Mavuika. And even if you are still using Furina, Risley's own constellations are still strong, so I'd recommend prioritizing his own. That way you aren't putting all your eggs into one support basket and still have the flexibility to choose between them. And then for Kinich, Emily is way bigger than Furina for him. If you don't have Emily, you are likely using Furina though, but even then I'd highly advise prioritize getting Emily to replace Furina here, rather than getting Furina's constellations. And even if you don't desire to get Emily, Furina's constellations are still not a priority, as Kinich's own constellations are much stronger. Now moving on to characters that it can go either way, I have Navia, Noel, and Tainari. Navia is here because while her own constellations are not good and not advised to go for, you can get a good return on an investment by getting Shalom into C2 or Chiori to C1 R1 if using her. In addition to that, Frina isn't definitively best in slot on Navia's team. She is the best option for maximizing Navia's damage, but you get more sub DPS damage using Mafrika or Xiangling, so you could be using one of them instead. Thus, going for constellations on your second geo is a good idea because it'll be a great investment whether your last slot is Farina, Mavrika, or Xiangling. And Noel is here for a very similar reason. You could prioritize Farina constellations, or you could prioritize getting Shilon into C2 so that she can be used in triple geo Noel teams, or you could prioritize getting Chiori to C1 R1 so that she'll be getting 2 dolls even if using Goro or C2 Shilonin instead of Kachina. All of these are great investment routes for Noel, and you'll see good returns no matter which you prioritize. And Tanari, I wasn't fully sure where to put him. At first I had him in the tier for characters that don't use Farina, because his best team is a Quicken team where you quick swap between him and Yaimiko, but I have heard several players say that Quick Bloom is also a good option for Tainari, in which case Farina's Constellations would be the best investment option. In this case, it's not a bad idea to prioritize C2 Nahida for Tainari, since that will be a good investment regardless if playing Spread or Quick Bloom, but if you know for sure you're playing him in Quick Bloom, then prioritize Furina's Constellations. Next, the characters that Furina isn't best in slot with, but if you were to use her, her constellations would be the investment priority. Here I have Gaming, Diluc, and Eula. With Gaming, Melt with Seed Lally is way more damage than Vaporize with Furina, while also having way better AoE application as well, but Furina is the next best option, so prioritize her constellations if you don't plan to go with Melt. Diluc is a similar case to Gaming, although it's more nuanced with him. In Diluc's Melt Plunge team, he has to skip his skill and the burst, and not having particles produced by his skill can result in bad energy requirements for the rest of the team. And not being able to use his burst means Bennett has to be C6, otherwise the team doesn't function. Furthermore, Diluc needs to do 7 plunges for the Melt team to be a big upgrade over Vaporize. The timing for that can be difficult to pull off. So with all of those caveats considered, using Furina instead of Seed Lally for him is very valid, and you would naturally prioritize Furina's constellations in this case. And then Eula, I wasn't quite sure where to put her. I'm no Eula expert by any means, but my understanding is that her generally best team is still with Raiden, Bennett, and Rosaria. But that team gets messed up by Bennett C6, which a lot of players are likely to have by now, so Furina and Mika should be better than Bennett and Rosaria. If you are using Furina on a Eula team, Eula's own Constellation 1 is okay but nothing exceptional, and her C2 is terrible, so Furina's constellations are without question the best investment. And now lastly, the characters that don't use Furina to begin with. For this, I have Arlecchino, Mavrika, Kaching, Child, Mualani, and Ganyu. Arlecchino and Mavrika are both way better off using Seed Lally for Melt instead of Vaporize, and even if you are using them in Vaporize, they have very strong constellations of their own that should be prioritized. Kaching is an aggravate DPS, so you'd be best off getting Nahida to C2. Child doesn't use Frina at all, even as an alternative to other options. Mualani, I highly advise against using Frina with her because she can still vaporize and mess everything up. There are simply many better options you can use for the last slot in a Mualani team. Even if you were using Furina for whatever reason, Mualani's constellations are absurdly broken, so you'd always prioritize those. And then Ganyu, her freeze teams are just not strong at all. Melt is way better for her. And unless I forgot someone worth mentioning, that's everyone. To recap, here is the full tier list. One thing I would like to add though is, while some of these units are better off prioritizing their own constellations, it may still be better value for your account as a whole to prioritize Furina's constellations, since she carries over to so many other teams. But with this, I hope you were able to make a more informed decision on whether or not investing into Furina's constellations is ideal for your account. If you liked today's video, please be sure to like and subscribe and comment down below. Also, feel free to join my Discord where you can communicate with me and my community directly. Thanks and goodbye.